dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
One of the most important things, never, ever quit. Never quit. One of the things about loving what you do is that it's not work, and therefore you don't quit automatically. It's a lot easier not to quit. But you can never give up.
It's harder than a lot of you thought it might be. Sometimes it may make you feel like that it's not possible. You might want to give up.
We believe in you.
Don't give up. I don't want you to feel discouraged. I want you to understand that it just means we got to push that much harder.
For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life.
Hey, thanks for joining my live stream tonight. It's September 9th. We're in the election season now, and I'm starting to see Biden signs and Trump signs everywhere. And I wanted to mention this opening segment for my live streams. I show a clip of President Trump, and then right after that I show a clip of Vice President or President Obama. Sorry, it's late. I've been up for a long time today. And the reason I do that is because it sort of weeds people out that are highly partisan. And I don't really want my channel to be a super partisan channel. My channel is more like an independent channel. Those of us that are still rational thinkers that are left in the world, there's not too many of us, but there are a few. You know my politics. I'm in the center, but I lean a little to the right. So I definitely am more on the Republican side than the Democrat side, but I am an independent, and one of the curses of being an independent is that you piss off everybody. I was just somebody sent me an email message yesterday that they were unsubscribing from my channel and they'll never watch me again because I passively mention in my ending segment on most of my videos that the state of Maine is spying on Black Lives Matter protesters, and they are super hardcore Republicans, and any mention of Black Lives Matter, they're out. They don't want to watch me anymore. But I mean, I'm not supporting Black Lives Matter. I'm not doing any of that. I really don't have any position on it other than the fact that all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, everybody matters. And it's wrong for the government to spy on any protesters, whether you're Black Lives Matter protester or you're a Tea Party protester. The government spying on you is wrong, and we have to accept that. But anyway, today I wanted to discuss a case that happened in Maine quite a few years ago, but supposedly it brought about some reforms in the state, and I'm not so sure that it did. So let's learn about this case together. This is the case of Katherine Hagarty. Deputy describes Hagarty shooting. Officers told Katherine Hagarty was a crack shot. Second happened in Jackman, Maine. A deputy who was at the secluded camp when 51-year-old Katherine Hagarty was shot and killed last week. And this was written May 28, 1992. So this is quite an old article. Said Wednesday that the officers involved were afraid she might be suicidal and decided to enter the camp when they thought she was away from her gun. Thomas Giroux, a part-time deputy with the Somerset County Sheriff's Department, said that at one point She was lying in bed with the gun across her lap. We didn't know what her intentions were. I know it sounds terrible, but I think we were used, Giroux said during an interview from his Jackman home. Giroux, a longtime friend of the Hagartys, said the officers did what they had to do under the circumstances. This was the last thing in the world we wanted to happen, he said. Giroux was the first to arrive at the truck stop where 4 fishermen had taken refuge after fleeing from their campsite just 125 feet from the Hagartys' camp. The fishermen said that Hagarty had fired numerous shots from her front porch and then chased them from the area. Giroux awaited the arrival of Sergeant Wilford Hines, a Somerset County deputy, and Trooper Gary Wright of the Maine State Police. The officers put on their bulletproof vests at the truck stop. Giroux did not have one and borrowed one from Wright, he said. He disputed statements from one of the fishermen, Robert Day of Alfred, who told reporters about a week after the incident that he had overheard the officers say that they were going into the camp to take her out. Giroux remembered a short briefing in the parking lot during which Hines or Wright cautioned the other officers about the situation. They said, "Look, we know she's a crack shot. If something goes bad and we have to take her, don't hesitate. Don't wait for somebody to get hurt. If we have to, don't hesitate just because she's a woman," Giroux related. When the officers arrived, Giroux stood in the driveway in front of the camp and tried to talk to Hagarty while the other officers positioned themselves around the camp. An unidentified deputy was outside Hagarty's window after about 15 minutes with no verbal response, he shined his flashlight into her bedroom. The deputy told the others that she was lying on the bed with a rifle across her lap. He ducked when he saw her begin to raise the rifle in the direction, and he shut off his flashlight, Giroux said. Giroux then heard Hagarty holler out, "How do I know what your intentions are?" I said, "Kathy, you know me. My intentions are honorable," Giroux related. The officers never saw her move from the bedroom to the living room, Giroux said. The next contact they had with her was a few minutes later when she pressed her face near the front window and spotted Somerset Deputy Renee Guay. She said, "I see you there," and that's when Guay shines his flashlight inside, Giroux said. Hagarty was kneeling near the couch below the window where Guay was positioned with a shotgun. She was smiling, Giroux said. He said Guay and Hines had earlier told Hagarty they were there, introduced themselves, and tried to convince her to leave the cabin. It was Guay who attempted to convince her to leave the cabin by telling her that the police were looking into some area camp break-ins. Guay asked her if she had seen 4 campers in the area that might have been involved in the break-ins, and Hagarty told him she hadn't seen anyone, Giroux said. Trooper Wright didn't say anything because they'd had a run-in before and they didn't want to anger her, so he kept quiet, Giroux said. A few minutes later, Guay yelled to Hines and Wright, who were positioned at the front door. He said, "I don't see a gun. Go for it." Giroux remembered. Hines and Wright charged into the door, but the chain lock prevented it from opening all the way. In the few seconds it took the officers to push the door again and get through, Hagarty had picked up the rifle, Giroux said. "I heard them yell, 'Put the gun down, put the gun down, put it down.' But she just stood there and smiled and kept raising it. When it got into position where it was aiming right at those guys, they fired," he said. That all took place within a couple of seconds, Giroux said. Giroux said if the door had opened on the first try, the shooting would not have occurred. "We never saw her go into the living room. We thought she might have left the gun in the bedroom, but come to find out she had brought it with her and hid it under the couch," Giroux said. After the shooting, the officers found a note tacked on the inside of the door. Giroux said they looked at the note and saw it made some reference to Catherine's husband, Jack Hagarty, but they didn't read it. The note was seized as evidence by the state attorney general's office. On Wednesday, Attorney General Michael Carpenter said the note was not a suicide note, but was a kind of rambling. He said it was the kind of note that seemed to be left there for someone who might go to the camp and find it locked up. It did not contain some obscenities, Carpenter said. The suicide theory, however, seemed to contradict statements made by Jack Hagarty, who said his wife called him and his 2 sons on the day of the shooting. Jack Hagarty said his wife was in good spirits and was thrilled about the trip she planned to embark on the following day. She planned to make a circuitous trip back to Florida and had made up itinerary cards and sent them to friends in Maine and relatives in Massachusetts and a sister in Wisconsin. She was bubbling with joy, Jack Hagarty said. Drew acknowledged that the officers were not sure that a suicide was her intention, but at the time it was a concern for them. Hindsight is 20/20, but the way the circumstances presented themselves, in my opinion, I think we did what we had to do. It was a terrible thing that happened. There is no reward in this, Giroux said. The Attorney General's office is scheduled to release the results of the investigation during a press conference on Thursday in Augusta. Interesting case. Quite an interesting case. So Katherine died as a result of the gunshot wounds, and obviously in the aftermath of the shooting, the police had their story, but the evidence told a different story. This is another case, although it happened in the 90s, where it reeks of a cover-up happening, and police coordinating their stories and telling a story, an official story, that doesn't line up with the evidence that's at hand. Now, I wasn't sure that I wanted to read this, but sometimes legal briefs... Oh, and this is a live stream, so if you have any comments, please write them and I will address the comments, or if you have any questions or just observations, or if I miss anything, tell me. If you know about this story, definitely chime in. But sometimes court documents give you a better sense of the details of the case than newspaper articles. They definitely stick to the facts. And we'll see what the facts are when Hagarty versus Somerset County was filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the First Circuit. Let's see. On May 15, 1992, I'll blow this up a little. State and county law enforcement officers forcibly entered a remote cabin in the woods of Maine, in the Maine woods, without a warrant, and mortally wounded plaintiff's descendant, Katherine Hagarty, while attempting to arrest her for reckless endangering the safety of 4 campers. Plaintiff John Hagarty initiated the present action in federal district court for compensatory and punitive damages against the defendants, officers, and their respective supervisors, based on alleged violations of the Hagarty's statutory and constitutional rights. After rejecting their qualified immunity claim, the district court determined that the defendant officers were potentially liable for punitive damages, and the officers initiated an interlocutory appeal. Plaintiff Hagarty, John Hagarty, in turn, John Hagarty, of course, is the husband, in turn cross-appealed from the district court, blah, blah, blah. The warrantless entry, this is a part of the background. During the morning of that fateful day, 2 vehicles containing 4 campers entered through a gate onto woodlands owned by a paper mill in Jackman, Maine. Proceeded to their assigned campsite about 1.5 miles past the gate and 200 yards or so beyond the Hagarty cabin. Around 9 p.m. in the evening, Katherine Hagarty became extremely agitated when she saw the campers returning to their campsite for the night and began screaming that they had trespassed on her property. The campers assured her that that the caretaker had given them permission to use the campsite and they would be leaving the next morning, to which Katherine responded, "Only if you make it until next morning." She then retrieved a rifle from inside the cabin and fired 6 rounds from the porch in the direction of the campers, who immediately took cover behind their trucks in a boat. During the next 4 hours or so, Katherine reloaded her rifle several times, firing approximately 25 additional rounds in the direction of the campers, before eventually yielding to their pleas for permission to depart and safety. Leaving their other belongings behind, the campers drove their vehicles quickly past the cabin, where they saw Katherine on the porch, rifle in hand. Although no further shots were fired, Katherine followed the campers in her truck beyond the entrance gate and then turned back in the direction of her cabin. Upon their arrival at the truck stop located on Route 202, approximately 2 miles from the Woods Road entrance gate, the campers immediately placed a telephone call to the Somerset County Sheriff's Department. Their report describes a harrowing encounter with an intoxicated, distraught, quote, flipped out, unquote, an armed woman who might pursue them to the truck stop and shoot at them. 4 law enforcement officers were dispatched to the truck stop, Maine State Trooper Gary Wright and 3 Somerset County Sheriff's Department officers, Patrol Sergeant Wilfred Hines, Deputy Sheriff Renee Guay, and Reserve Officer Thomas Giroux, Jr. After briefly interviewing the 4 campers, the officers decided that the suspect had committed at least one offense by shooting at the campers. The offense would be reckless endangerment. Moreover, from the description the campers gave of the woman, the locations of the cabin and the campsite, and from their knowledge of the area, the officers concluded that Katherine Hagarty was their suspect. The officers knew that Katherine was an expert hunter and a licensed Maine guide with a reputation as a crack shot, a quote, crack shot, end quote, and that she kept several powerful firearms at the cabin. Further, the officers knew she had some history of emotional instability. She had a nervous breakdown in 1991 that required sedation, physical restraints, and a brief period of involuntary hospitalization. Interesting. Substance abuse, 2 arrest records for operating a motor vehicle while under the influence, and incidents of erratic, violent behavior directed at law enforcement personnel. Kicking and throwing punches at State Trooper Gary Wright, asking irrational questions and exhibiting extreme mood swings, alternately screaming and laughing at the time of her first OUI arrest, and an assault on harassment against Trooper Wright at his residence shortly after the same arrest. For these reasons, the officers concluded that they should arrest Katherine immediately without obtaining a warrant or informing her of their true intentions until after she had been restrained, for fear that she would become violent. At around midnight, the officers rendezvoused with a 5th officer, Sergeant William Crawford, Jr. of the Somerset County Sheriff's Department, drove about 3 miles and parked their cruisers approximately a mile from the Hagarty cabin. Their sporadic discussions since meeting at the truck stop had led to a skeleton plan of action for effecting the arrest. Concerned that Katherine might be waiting for them somewhat in the vicinity, they proceeded on foot toward her cabin, led by Trooper Wright, with a police dog, in an effort to forewarn themselves of Katherine's presence without heralding their approach. As they neared at approximately 12:15 a.m., wow, so it was real dark in the morning, the officers observed Katherine's truck in front of the darkened cabin and heard a radio blaring music from inside. The clearing surrounding the cabin was plainly visible in the moonlight, but the cabin's interior was not illuminated. Interesting. Following a quick visual inspection of the cabin site and the interior of the Hagarty truck, 4 officers approached unannounced and placed themselves along the outer cabin walls. The 5th officer, Thomas Giroux, Jr., who was better acquainted with Katherine Hagarty, gave a pre-arranged signal to the other officers from behind a tree across the road in front of the cabin. Giroux began calling to Katherine by name, first identifying himself and then expressing concern for her safety in an attempt to coax her from the cabin to speak with him. Giroux heard no response above the blaring radio. Sergeant Hines then pounded on the cabin door and identified himself as a deputy sheriff. He received no response either. Meanwhile, Sergeant Crawford, who had worked his way around to the rear of the cabin, shined a flashlight into the darkened window and saw a fully clothed woman lying on a bed with a rifle across her chest. When the woman began to raise the rifle in his direction, Crawford dove for cover yelling out to the other officers that there was an armed person inside the cabin. Catherine soon asked Crawford to identify himself. After he did so, Crawford heard Catherine leave the bedroom and move toward the front of the cabin. The radio soon became inaudible. As Catherine walked about inside the cabin, the darkened cabin, she kept asking what the officers were doing there and requesting that they leave her property. The officers replied that they were investigating a report of campsite burglaries in the area, were concerned for her safety, and wanted her to come out of the cabin so she could speak with them. Laughing intermittently during these exchanges, Catherine ultimately rejected their request, stating that she had seen no one suspicious. Deputy Sheriff Rene Guay posted outside the closed window at the front of the cabin, next saw Catherine face to face as she peered out the window from her kneeling position on a nearby couch. When Guay trained his flashlight on her, Catherine said, "I can see you." At the time, Guay observed that Catherine had no weapon in hand, nor within the vicinity illuminated by his flashlight. Guay immediately communicated this information to Sergeant Hines and Trooper Wright, who were posted on either side of the front door, then gave them a signal to go. Sergeant Hines proceeded to break in the front door, but a chain lock momentarily delayed entry. From a crouched position outside the front window, Guay saw Catherine pick up a rifle beside the couch and began to raise it in the direction of Hines and Wright, who were about to break through the front door. As she continued to raise the rifle in their direction, the officers ordered her to drop it. Catherine paid no heed and was fatally wounded by the officers before she could fire a shot. Interesting. So, based on that description, we have Katherine Hagarty, who has a history of mental disease. We have campers that were camping at a site near her cabin. We have a lot of questions that are not answered yet. Namely, the campsite was not on her property, but was she made aware that those campers were going to be in the area? That's issue number one. And issue number two is when the officers talked to the campers, they were telling stories that she was shooting at them. But when they went out to the site, could they verify that they were being shot at? Did they find shell casings? Did they find any bullets? Or were they just taking the word of these campers? Because to me, it sounds like they do not have enough evidence to make an arrest of her. Maybe if they could get her out of her cabin and talking to them, and she would admit that she was shot at them, then they would have probable cause and they could make the arrest. But at this point, they just have these campers that are saying that there was a crazy woman that they don't even know who she was shooting at them, and the officers kind of have this confab in a parking lot, and they decide that, oh, the suspect has to be Katherine Hagarty, and so they go out there with a pre-devised plan to actually get her out of the cabin under a pretense or pretext, and then arrest her based on what the campers had said, rather than talk to her, get her to admit that she had shot at the campers, and then arrest her. And then we have another issue that, it's a glaring issue. Number one, you have the right to have a firearm in Maine. I don't know if what the laws were back in the 90s. Maybe there's a case that she shouldn't have a firearm because of her mental illness that was documented. But the police officers would not know whether she had a legal right to possess a firearm or not unless they did some more research. And number two, you have the Constitution, which gives you the right to your person's possessions and papers inside your residence. And the only way that a police officer can enter your residence or your property is with a warrant. And the police admit that they don't have a warrant. So, even if she did raise her gun up and shoot the officers, she would be in the right, not them. That's my first impression here. This article also was published actually earlier this year. 18 years ago, back in 2002, which kind of gives an update about the shooting, which I think is very informative to what happened here. The Hagarty shooting tempers police attitude on standoffs. In a remote cabin at the end of a logging road outside Jackman, a group of police officers crept up to the house of Katherine Hagarty and burst through the door a decade ago. Facing the barrel of a loaded rifle, they shot the 51-year-old woman dead. The events leading to Hagarty's death on May 16, 1992, sparked a wave of criticism and questions about police responses to standoff situations. A task force appointed by then Attorney General Michael Carpenter examined Maine laws regarding police use of force. Just based on what we already know about this case, a lot of mistakes were made by the police. This woman did not have to die that day. So many mistakes were made. The police can't just show up and execute you because you exercise a few rights. The task force, the events leading to Hagarty's death on May 16, 1992, sparked a wave of criticism and questions about police responses to standoff situations. A task force appointed by then Attorney General Michael Carpenter examined Maine laws regarding police use of force. The task force recommendations led to new laws that dramatically raised the minimum standard for law enforcement officers in Maine. Entrance requirements for police cadets were raised, training was expanded for all new officers, and new policies were established for local police dealing with high-risk situations. And here we go. Brian McMaster, Chief of Investigations for the State Attorney General's Office and Chairman of the Criminal Justice Academy Board of Trustees, said one of the most significant changes precipitated by Hagarty's shooting was not incorporated into any law or policy. There is probably a greater sense of accountability in law enforcement in terms of the actions and operations they undertake, a greater sense they're going to be held accountable to the public, said McMaster. What a joke, what a laugh. That's actually a comedy sketch that he would say that, because that is not true. And did you catch that he says that one of the most significant changes precipitated by Hagarty's shooting was not incorporated into any law or policy? Meaning that they did not at all make any changes after this shooting. But let's continue and see if I am mistaken here. An investigation after Hagarty's death cleared the officers of any criminal wrongdoing. I mean, we just went through all the wrong they did, and they were cleared. But Carpenter was highly critical, declaring their tactics ill-conceived, poorly planned, and hastily executed. Not to mention, violated the Constitution, violated standard police protocol, violated civil rights, violated human rights. Let's not mention all those other tactics. I mean, let's face it, she was a crazy woman. But she never shot. They said she was a crackpot shot, but she was shooting at campers for like 20 minutes or whatever. 20 shots, I think is what they said, and she never hit them. So obviously she wasn't aiming for the campers, even if you buy the campers story that she was shooting at them, which I have no reason to doubt. I'm sure that happened. There's really no reason to doubt that happened. But the fact is, the police officers could not have known, based on the story from the campers, that Hagarty was the one that was shooting at them. They just said there was a crazy woman out by their campsite that was shooting at them. So the police officers could not have known that it was Katherine Hagarty. And then, even though she was holding a gun when she was laying in bed, she never shot the officers. She raised her gun at the officers while she was in her house. But you're allowed to do that while you're in your house. She didn't know who those officers were. It was just a dude shining a flashlight into her house. She had the radio on. She couldn't hear them say that she was that they were police officers. And once she determined that they were police officers, we only have their word after they killed her. I mean, keep in mind they killed her. So this is not a he said, she said. This is there's a dead victim and they made up a story, basically. That I'm not saying they did, but to me it certainly sounds like this was a cover your butt scenario where they probably made up a story. Let me read this again. An investigation after Hagarty's death cleared the officers of any criminal wrongdoing, but Carpenter was highly critical, declaring their tactics ill-conceived, poorly planned, and hastily executed. Highly critical? We have officers that violated so many normal standard procedures of police, but they get no punishment. They're cleared, except for the Attorney General puts a statement saying, well, they could have done better, but we're clearing them. This is why police officers in Maine feel like they can get away with anything, because even when it's so clear that they messed up, it's like blaringly clear. Even their story proves that they messed up. They don't get punished. They're cleared. It's disgusting. And of course, Brian McMaster is involved. He's always involved. DL writes, Brian McMaster, Chief of Investigation for State AG and Chairman of the Criminal Justice Academy, is a gross conflict of interest. Amen. Not to mention, he is a former police officer himself, and basically, as far as I can tell, he's the de facto AG of the state of Maine going back, I don't even know how long. This story is from 1992. I mean, is this guy immortal or something? He just keeps going and going. The whole incident involving Hagarty took about 11 minutes. Hagarty was a veteran Maine guide who had run hunting camps in areas surrounding Jackman near the Canadian border. The incident arose after a confrontation with some fishermen who camped near the property. Hagarty, who appeared highly intoxicated at the time, fired shots over the heads and chased them away. Actually, let's look at it from her perspective for a second. You have a whole bunch of men that are hanging out right next to your camp. You don't know why they're there. You haven't been told that they're going to be there, and you just want them to go away because you're a single woman in your 50s in a cabin, in a remote cabin by yourself. I can see a scenario where firing shots over the head is not a crazy thing to do, but is a practical thing to do for your own safety. I'm not saying that she wasn't crazed and drunk and all that stuff, but if I'm getting shots fired over my head, I'm probably going to think she's crazed, whether it's the truth or not. I mean, the police there's a thing that happens in law enforcement where the first person to dial the police, the first person to contact the police is the person that the police believe. Or if the police respond to a scene, the first person they talk to is the person that they end up always siding with. It's a psychological thing that police and sometimes we as humans do. And what makes a good police officer stand out from a poor police officer is the ability to get past that psychological gate or limitation that you have, where you actually follow the facts and the evidence, and wherever they take you, you respond accordingly and according to what the truth is, rather than the first person that contacts you. And these officers didn't do any of that. These officers did a horrible job. I'm not saying they're horrible police officers. Haven't researched them, but I'm saying in this case they did a horrible job and they deserved to be punished. Hagarty refused to come out of her cabin as ordered, and officers, believing that she had put down her gun, entered the cabin. They don't mention in this article, they entered the cabin illegally without a warrant. They didn't have any probable cause to go into the cabin. This was 100% an illegal entry, which makes it no different from a burglar smashing through your front door. At the instant that they smashed through her front door, even identifying themselves as police officer, she had the right to shoot them because it was an illegal search. They didn't say we have a warrant. They didn't say anything. And for those of you who think, well, they were police officers. Well, anybody can order police uniforms from a catalog store back in the 90s or from Amazon today. Anybody can order police uniforms, badge, guns, batons, all that stuff, and storm into a situation claiming to be police officers. In fact, they make movies about it. I think there's a movie, about a huge bank robbery in Boston where they dressed up as police officers. So just because you look like a police officer, you say you're a police officer and all that, doesn't mean you're a police officer. And the way that you can tell whether they're a police officer or not is when they say, knock, knock, we have a warrant to come into your house. If you don't open the door, we're going to smash it. Not smash into the door. That's how criminals act. She probably thought they were criminals. By the time the officers rammed the door open, Hagarty had retrieved her .22 caliber rifle. She aimed it toward the officers, and that's what the officers say. Keep in mind that the officers killed this girl, and they had time before investigators got there to coordinate their stories. I'm not saying they did, but I'm just saying that they very well could have made up the fact that she aimed the rifle at them. But even if she did, let's just take the facts as presented, she still wouldn't be violating the law. Think about that. A shotgun blast fired by one of the officers. She aimed it toward the officers. A shotgun blast fired by one of the officers at the window killed her instantly. The situation turned out to be vastly different from one on April 4 in the same part of the state, long after new policies and training standards had been adopted. A drunken and despondent man locked himself in his Jackman house and refused to come out. Some of the best armed and best trained police in the state took position around his house and waited. They negotiated, talked, and waited patiently for 6 hours until the man finally came out voluntarily. So you can sort of see how this story has developed. You can sort of see that the police screwed up majorly. And as far as the police reforms that came out of this story was brought to us and written in June 24, 2020, about how Maine has updated its rules for use of force based on the incidents that have happened all around the country that have caused all these mass things to riots to and protests around the country. Brian McMaster claimed that they suggested changes of the use of force and standoffs and entry into a house after this Hagarty shooting, but they never implemented any of it. And the few things that they suggested was that, because we talked about this case, that's basically what he said. Because we talked about this case, and because the Attorney General said the officers could have done a little better, now police know that there's more accountability and they're going to guard their behaviors a little more. Well, that's just nothing. That's not a reform. That doesn't have any accountability with a bite. Police officers still know that they can get away with anything they want. If a child messes up and then you say, you messed up, but we're not going to punish you in any way, do you think that child's going to stop doing whatever it was that he did? He's going to keep doing it. And the police in Maine have zero accountability. We don't even have a citizen oversight committee in the state of Maine. And I live in Boston, but I'm from Maine. My heart's in Maine. I'm a Mainer through and through. And I've had reasons to, tell these stories about how Maine has no police accountability. And it's because of stories like this. Let's recap this story really quickly. The police receive a call that there's a crazed woman with a gun. Based on nothing more than the statements of a few people, an entire, basically, posse of police officers storm a 51-year-old woman's cabin in a remote part of Maine at 12:30 in the morning. It's pitch black. They're storming the cabin with a dog in front of them, and they're using the moonlight to guide them. They get to her cabin and the radio's blaring, so she doesn't hear them say, hey, what's going on? The police are here. And the first sight she sees of them is when a flashlight is shined through her window and she has no clue who it is. And so she raises her gun up, she's sleeping with a gun because she's a 51-year-old woman in the remote part of Maine. Who knows what could happen? You know, that's not an uncommon thing. And she sees this flashlight, so she points it. The flashlight goes down. She shuts off her radio. She then starts a dialogue. And then these people who claim to be police officers smash through her door and kill her. And then they get no punishment whatsoever at all when they violated her civil rights, her human rights, her constitutional rights. They violated every single norm, standard protocol, or standard operating procedure of a police officer, and they get no punishment. Even if you take the facts the way that the police lay them out, and I'm sure they tried to cover their butt, they still are wrong here, and they should have been punished. They should have lost their jobs over this. They killed the woman. The consequence of them screwing up is not that she got bruised and had to go to the hospital. She died. They killed her. Maine updates rules for use of force bias based on profiling. Not sure if this relates 100% with the Katherine Hagarty shooting, but this is their latest attempt to try to reform and bring accountability to police, but once again, it fails miserably. In response to racial bias and police brutality in other parts of the country, the Maine Criminal Justice Academy Board of Trustees made changes to the state's use of force rules. Trustees also made it mandatory to report any bias-based profiling complaints. We were all horrified to watch the situation in Minneapolis, and quite frankly, just the conversation around use of force and bias-based policing and race relations all kind of came in that to the head, said Rick Desjardins, butchering that name, the Academy's director. He said the policies were implicit in law enforcement, and now the 7 basic written rules. So basically, they're just trying to put lipstick on a pig because they want the violent protests to stay out of Maine. That's basically all this is. He said the policies were implicit in law enforcement and now are 7 basic written rules. Whether it's chokeholds, whether it's intervening, whether it's bias-based reporting, we felt like codifying those into minimal standards were important, Desjardins said. The standards ban chokeholds, excessive force, and firing weapons at moving vehicles unless deadly force is authorized. They also require officers to provide aid anytime a person is in custody, appears to be injured, or is in medical distress. And now it's mandatory for officers to intervene and report to superiors when they see any other officer using unreasonable and unnecessary force. You are required to report it. If you don't, you're just as guilty as the person who did it, Desjardins said. Yeah, that's a laugh. That's just lip service, because if a cop in Maine ever did something, they would, unless it's on dash cam and maybe they release it, the Maine cover-up Inc., led by Brian McMaster, would make sure that it never became public. You're required to report it. Next line. I can tell you right now that the officers we train in this state, if they saw what happened in Minneapolis, they would have said something. They would have done something, he said. The shooting of Katherine Hagarty at a remote cabin in Jackson in 1992 led to public outcry and prompted what is known as the Hagarty Law, which creates rules for setting minimum standards for the use of deadly force. After the Hagarty shooting, some really, really smart people in the state made some changes, and other states, quite frankly, are so envious of what we're able to do, Desjardins said, referring to the board's ability to decertify officers. Law enforcement departments in Maine must adopt written policies that align with those established by the Criminal Justice Academy's Board of Trustees. I challenge anybody to find me an officer in Maine that has been decertified based on this supposed Hagarty law. email that person's name to me. I did some research today and couldn't find one. That is just another lip service law that they put into effect because they do not hold police officers accountable in the state of Maine. In fact, there's an ongoing thing in Maine's entire history, and Maine's been a state since 1820. So or 1825, something like that. So we're working on, 200 years. In a 200-year history, Maine has not had a single unjustified police-involved shooting where the officers were punished. This Katherine Hagarty one would be prime example of why there is no police accountability. There was also a shooting that I looked into where the police did not have to kill or fire their weapons. Although it's controversial, a lot of people will say that I'm being stupid for even saying this. But I looked into the shooting of Amber Fagree and Cadhar Bailey, and they did not have to die. That was in Vassalboro. The state police were called out to investigate a burglary. They found the getaway car, for lack of a better term, and they opened fire on it and killed 2 people, including a passenger who had, by all accounts, nothing to do with the burglary that happened earlier that day. There should have been some punishments handed down there. I'm not saying that Trooper Parks or Lieutenant Ireland should have lost their jobs as a result of those shootings, but there should have been punishments handed down, just like in this Hagarty shooting. Although in this Hagarty shooting, everybody should have lost their job. This was unacceptable. Everybody should have lost their job. Are police policies and training in the 90s any different than today's policies and training? Well, supposedly they are, but the rules that they supposedly implemented have never resulted in anybody being disciplined that I can find. So I put a challenge out there. If I'm wrong about that, please email me, send a message, put a comment under this video, anything. Just get the message to me that there have been officers who have been punished as a result of the changes that were made after the Hagarty shooting, the supposed Hagarty law. I couldn't find any, and I looked. I'm not saying that they're not out there. I'm just saying that I couldn't find any. And I mean, I did put in a full day today. I am sort of burning, the candle at both ends right now, so I could have missed it. But I haven't seen anything like that. So that's what I wanted to say on that. Check out this, and then I'll be right back after this. I remember my elementary school back in the 80s taking a trip to Boston to go to the Science Museum. And I was pretty amazed by all the exhibits and touring through the Science Museum. But the city itself kind of scared me as a boy that grew up in rural Maine. All the lights and sounds, the horns honking. It was a new experience for me. And when I was returning back to Maine, I remember looking out the bus window and seeing the Piscataqua River Bridge in the distance. I remember driving toward it as a passenger in the bus and thinking, once I'm on the other side of that bridge, I'm going to be in Maine. I'm going to be safe. Everything's going to be okay. Only another hour until I'm home. Now as an adult, in light of everything that's happened to me, in light of the state of Maine retaliating against me for being critical of them on social media about a police-involved shooting, now I have a whole different feeling when I approach the Piscataqua River Bridge. I drive through New Hampshire, I go through the toll booth, pay the toll. I drive to Portsmouth. And then I start to approach the bridge, and all of a sudden, this feeling comes over me. This feeling Once I'm on the other side of that bridge, am I going to be safe? Once I'm on the other side of that bridge, are the police going to pull me over in retaliation? Are they going to throw the book at me? Will I get another false charge? The anxiety that I feel just builds up. You go over the bridge ribs. You hear the sound of your tires make. Clunk, 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 clunk. And then you're on the bridge. And then you're in Maine. The safety that I once felt by being inside the borders of Maine has gone away, and now it's been replaced with anxiety, fear that I feel when I enter the state of Maine, when I cross the Piscataqua River Bridge. So today, in my ongoing fight with the state of Maine, we filed our first brief at the Maine Supreme Court, otherwise known as the law court when you're doing appeals of this nature, which is an administrative appeal. And this is not part of the brief. The brief is an appeal brief, so it's kind of written differently. It's a very, very good brief written by my attorney, Roger Hurley. But I wrote these notes to my attorney to help him remind him of the whole case and give him sort of a nutshell, point by point, or bullet point, the history of my case. And I thought that I would just, since today is the day that we filed our first brief, I thought I would just go through and read this bullet point history of my case. I talk about it all the time, but I don't get into a lot of detail about it. I really want my YouTube channel to be about corruption in Maine and what's happening to other people that are going through things that are similar to what I went through. But I'm just going to read this through so that you guys have a really good idea of exactly what happened to me and how Maine is a very corrupt state. And by the time we finish these bullet points, I think you will agree with that statement that I just made. So it starts out, bullet point 1, Joshua Gray is a 43-year-old and has been a licensed private investigator since 2001. He has held or currently holds private investigator licenses in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, New Jersey, and Tennessee. Throughout his 19 years as a professional investigator, Mr. Gray has no complaints against his many licenses. None of his licenses have been revoked, suspended, or had any disciplinary action taken against them. Joshua grew up in Scarborough, Maine, went to college at the University of Maine, and moved away to find work. He eventually settled in Massachusetts, where he started NSI Surveillance and Investigation in 2003. In order for his new company to be able for his new company to be added to the vendors lists of insurance companies, he was advised to advertise as a regional company that could accept work in all New England states. To comply with all laws, Joshua entered into subcontractor agreements with private investigators in Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. Joshua was licensed in Massachusetts and New Hampshire during this time. In 2003, Ray Wood, a licensed professional investigator from Parham, Maine, informed Joshua the Maine State Police were corrupt and only granted private investigator licenses to retired state troopers and law enforcement officers. This is how Mr. Gray recalls the conversation. He has since heard the same thing mentioned by many others. Also in 2003, Joshua applied for a private investigator license in Maine. The license was denied just as Mr. Wood had predicted. The reason for the denial was that Joshua had a few speeding tickets and parking tickets. Mr. Gray, who was at the very beginning stages of building his business, did not appeal the denial and decided his limited resources would be better used to build his business. Joshua established vendor relationships with some large insurance companies, including Liberty Mutual Insurance, and quickly became a preferred investigator for claim handlers and insurance adjusters. All assignments in Maine were subcontracted to licensed Maine investigators. In May 2011, Joshua Gray applied for a Maine professional license for the second time. Maine State Police Detective David Pelletier learned that Mr. Gray had come to Maine to conduct training with a licensed Maine investigator and charged Joshua with working in Maine without a private investigator's license. The application was placed on hold pending the outcome of the criminal charges. In 2015, after a 3-year legal battle, the charges were dismissed with prejudice by then Superior Court Justice Jeffrey Helm. In 2015, after the charges were dismissed, Detective David Pelletier, at the direction of Lieutenant Scott Ireland, contacted Liberty Mutual Insurance and informed them that Mr. Gray was under a, quote, investigation that is ongoing, end quote. This contact appeared to be in retaliation for winning in court, had no investigatory purpose or probable cause, and was just mean-spirited. As a result of this, Liberty Mutual immediately dropped Mr. Gray and his company from their vendors list. After the devastating news of losing his largest client, Joshua scrambled to rebuild his business, find a less expensive place for his young family to live, and eventually was forced to live in an old motorhome in a friend's driveway, and then had no choice but to move into his parents' house in Maine with his wife and 2 children. While living in Maine, Joshua commuted to Massachusetts and New Hampshire to work. Eventually, his wife and children moved to Tennessee so she could live closer to her family and support network and more affordable rent. Soon, Joshua's young children made friends and established social relationships with a Tennessee middle school and later high school. His wife and children are unlikely to return to New England, and his marriage has suffered significant hardships. Despite being assured by Detective David Pelletier and Lieutenant Scott Ireland that Mr. Gray's private investigator application would be placed on hold pending the outcome of the criminal charge, they denied the application, citing the very charge that was just dismissed by Justice Jeffrey Helm as the only reason. Joshua appealed the denial of his professional investigator application. However, due to the limited financial resources and advice from his counsel, entered into a consent agreement on February 2015, where he agreed to withdraw his application, wait 12 months, and then reapply. Joshua filed a complaint against Detective David Pelletier, Lieutenant Scott Ireland, and Sergeant Michael Johnston with the Office of Professional Standards, led by Lieutenant Anna Love of the Maine State Police, for retaliating against him after winning in court and unethically and illegally violating his constitutional and civil rights. In May 2015, Joshua posted an article on various social media networks titled Maine State Police Violate Civil, Constitutional, and Human Rights of Massachusetts PI that was read thousands of times and posted and shared by others. In June 2015, Joshua posted a video on YouTube titled The Same Thing, and that was viewed thousands of times. After posting the above-mentioned video and article and video, Joshua was contacted by many people, including private investigator Bob Doyon, a PI from Greene, Maine, who relayed a very similar story and experience with Detective David Pelletier and Lieutenant Scott Ireland. Mr. Gray wrote an article about Mr. Doyon's experience and posted it on various social media platforms, including YouTube, in June of 2015. The article was titled, Second Victim Accused Maine State Police of Violating His Rights. This article was read and shared thousands of times. More people contacted Joshua about corruption within the Maine State Police, including some applying for concealed carry permits, other out-of-state private investigators, and more. Joshua again wrote an article about what he was hearing titled 5 Victims Now Say Maine State Police Violated Rights, and again posted it on various social media platforms, and it was read and shared thousands of times. In July 2015, Michael Harrington, the owner of Maine's largest private investigation firm and chairman of an oversight board that regulates the professional investigation industry in Maine, threatened to sue Joshua if he did not immediately delete his social media posts. Joshua did not delete the posts, however, instead wrote an article about getting the threatening letter titled Michael Harrington Threatens Lawsuit Against Massachusetts PI. This article was posted to various social media platforms and was read, shared, and reposted by others thousands of times. Also in July 2015, Lieutenant Anna Love of the Maine State Police Office of Professional Standards concluded her internal affairs investigation and found that Detective Pelletier, Lieutenant Ireland, and Sergeant Johnston did nothing wrong. In August 2015, the Maine State Police official Twitter account began following Joshua's Twitter account at Detective Josh. In November 2015, the Maine State Police sent Joshua a notice to delete all social media posts or face criminal charges, or to delete a social media post or face criminal charges. Rather than delete the post, he wrote an article titled "Free Speech Under Assault in Maine" and posted the article on various social media sites. It was read thousands of times and shared by others. They never followed through with their threat to charge him with a crime. Mr. Gray posted an article in April 2016 titled "Corruption Exposed at Maine State Police" on various platforms, and that was shared many times. Also in 2016, the Maine State Police blocked Joshua's Twitter account from viewing the official Maine State Police Twitter, preventing him from viewing important public safety updates or contacting the Maine State Police via Twitter in the event of an emergency. Also in 2016, Joshua spoke with a former professional investigator in Maine named Katherine Bierman, who was intimidated into not renewing her license by the Maine State Police, and he wrote an article titled "She Said, Reveals Corruption at Maine State Police." Joshua has also written many pro-police posts on social media, including praising some Maine State troopers for heroic actions. Labeling Josh as anti-police would be an inaccurate characterization of his social media post. While he is extremely critical of police who he perceives to be corrupt, Mr. Gray is very supportive of all police officers and highly respects them. In February 2017, Lieutenant Scott Ireland and Trooper Jeffrey Parks were involved in the fatal killing of Amber Fagree in Cadhar Bailey. Because Joshua had warned in several social media posts and articles that Lieutenant Ireland would eventually kill someone, he became interested in the shooting and posted on social media about it. He also replied to comments on his post. In January 2018, Joshua submitted an application for professional investigator license in Maine for the third time. He posted to Facebook on January 26, 2018, after submitting the application, and wrote, quote, "Most likely they'll make up another false charge against me, but I'm done being intimidated by the overwhelming evidence of corruption with regard to Lieutenant Scott Ireland and Detective David Pelletier," end quote. This statement seems to be prophetic in hindsight. In March 2018, the Maine Attorney General's office released their report on the fatal shooting of Amber Fagree in Cadhar Bailey. Mr. Gray read the report and immediately posted corrections to some speculative statements that he had made on social media about the shooting. Also in March 2018, Joshua was granted a private investigator license in the state of Tennessee. Mr. Gray had applied for this license around the same time he applied in Maine. The Tennessee authorities did not find his social media statements disqualifying. Also in July 2018, Joshua was emailed a spreadsheet of social media statements the Maine State Police determined were not true. He immediately posted the entire spreadsheet to his social media and wrote, quote, "I have always maintained that I want to get to the truth and will make corrections if I am wrong about anything," end quote. And also, quote, "I learned today that Lieutenant Scott Ireland was not suspected of being intoxicated or drunk," end quote. In September 2018, the state of Vermont granted Joshua a private investigator license. They also did not find his social media statements to be disqualifying. On August 31, 2018, the Maine State Police Colonel John Cody denied Mr. Gray's application for professional license, saying that because of some social media statements, he had poor moral character. Also in September 2018, Mr. Gray initiated an ADC final agency action appeal of the denial. In April 2019, the state of Massachusetts renewed Mr. Gray's private investigator license. They did not find his social media comments disqualifying. In May 2019, the state of Vermont renewed Joshua's private investigator license. They didn't find the social media comments disqualifying. In July 2019, Justice Michaela Murphy reversed the denial, however, quote, remanded to the department to conduct an appropriate process or proceeding which would enable it to determine if the petitioner's statements were made with actual malice as defined by Maine law, end quote. In September 2019, Mr. Gray answered 39 written questions from the state police. On October 2, 2019, Maine State Police Colonel John Cody yet again denied Joshua's professional investigator application. Mr. Gray immediately appealed the new denial. In January 2020, New Hampshire renewed Joshua's PI license. They were also not concerned with the social media comments. In March 2020, Tennessee renewed his license. They didn't care about the social media comments. In April 2020, Massachusetts renewed his PI license again. They didn't find the comments to be disqualifying. Also in May 2020, a Maine State whistleblower, Detective George Loader, filed a lawsuit claiming Lieutenant Scott Ireland and Sergeant Michael Johnston retaliated against him. These are the same troopers who retaliated against Joshua Gray in 2015. Also in May 2020, Justice Michaela Murphy affirmed the state police denial of the professional investigator application based on two things. First, that Mr. Gray wrote a social media comment that Lieutenant Ireland was, quote, most likely drunk, end quote, based on nothing more than speculation. And second, that Mr. Gray has a lengthy history of engaging in online diatribes against the same lieutenant, end quote. Mr. Gray claims the statements were taken out of context and is an opinion, and that calling out a corrupt police officer is not a diatribe, but one's patriotic duty. In June 2020, Mr. Gray published an article about the fatal shooting of Amber Frugary on various social media platforms titled Killed in Maine, a Controversial Police Shooting. It was read and shared thousands of times. So, that was the history of the case. I'm surprised there's still 5 people on here. That was pretty boring. But I just wanted to get the history of my case out there so that everybody could know what was going on with it. And I need to get a glass of water, but I'll come back and I'll go through the notes that I gave my attorney. This was not a brief, by the way. This was just notes that I gave my attorney about what my arguments would be if I were to write the brief, and he just used these notes to prepare the brief that he filed with the Supreme Court today. And I will read that brief that he filed, but I'll do that at a later point. Prior to Maine denying my PI license, I really was invisible. I just kept to myself. I did my own thing. I worked hard, kept my nose to the ground, built up my business, and then boom, I run into a brick wall of corruption up in Maine. If I hadn't have run into that brick wall of corruption, I would not be posting these videos right now. I would not be exposing corruption all throughout Maine government, pervasive corruption that infects every aspect of the public sector in the Maine state government, from the state police to local sheriff's departments to industries where cronyism just runs rampant. In fact, the corruption in Maine is so blatant and in your face, it just surprises me. You know, my life seemed more peaceful and more tranquil prior to knowing that my home state, the state that I love, the state that I want to move back to, the state that I wanted to move my family to and raise my kids in, is just so corrupt. And I'm speaking to the public officials right now, the public officials, the corrupt and dirty public officials in Maine. All you had to do was give me the PI license and I would have just shut up. I wouldn't have said anything. I would have just moved on with my life. I didn't want this fight. I mean, we have to be the change we want to see in the world, and when you see corruption as bad and as blatant as I see in Maine, what choice do I have? I don't want this for myself, but what choice do I have? So I appear to be losing my voice, but I got some water here. I've been up since like 6 this morning or 5:30 this morning. I worked a case, and I did some more research on some cases. I'm actually putting the finishing touches on on an article that I'm writing about a dirty cop and dealing with real estate in Maine. So I'm looking forward to getting that out. I've been doing research on some cases that I've covered in the past. I'm going to do some update stories on some of the cases that I was researching, but I put out videos on, but I've since received more information on. But let's just try to get through this right now. And then after we get through this, I'll probably cut this live stream off. So this, again, is just notes that I was giving to my attorney about my case. But I wrote the notes in the form of like I was writing the brief. So these are my own arguments, sort of. He went in a different route with his arguments, but I just wanted to get these out there right now. For the purpose of this, the only social media statement that will be discussed is the one the Superior Court used to affirm the denial, and that was the statement that, quote, Lieutenant Ireland was most likely drunk. The Superior Court also mentions a lengthy history of diatribes against the Maine State Police Lieutenant, Lieutenant Ireland, to support the finding that the one statement, most likely drunk, was made with malicious intent. However, it does not conclude the diatribes themselves were libelous or made with malicious intent. We would argue that warning about a corrupt police officer is not a diatribe, but the duty of every citizen to hold their government accountable. Peaceful protests are an important part of citizenship in democracy. This leaves the only reason for the denial of a professional investigator license is the statement, quote, most likely drunk, end quote. However, what the Superior Court fails to mention or see is the statement was not even a social media post. It was a comment buried under a social media post on Mr. Gray's Facebook page. This comment was only made one time and not repeatedly made as the state wants you to think. The Superior Court also fails to mention that Mr. Gray made several other comments under the same social media posts on the same day, such as, quote, why won't they release the officer's drug and alcohol test, end quote. Quote, was a blood and alcohol test even taken, end quote. Quote, was he drinking, end quote. Quote, was he drunk, end quote. End quote, was the cop drunk or drinking, end quote. When you read these comments written under the same social media post, it shows the true context, motivation, and intent of Mr. Gray's statement. He was clearly trying to articulate and learn whether Lieutenant Scott Ireland and Trooper Jeffrey Parks were tested for drugs or alcohol after killing someone in a fatal police-involved shooting. It appears that a drug and alcohol test was never conducted after they shot and killed 2 people in a police-involved shooting, and Mr. Gray was the only person to ask for a copy of the test and thus reveal that no test was taken. That's pretty much the gist of my notes. I'm not going to go through and read them all, I guess, because I kind of start ranting a little. But I wanted to get that out there. Today was the day that we filed the first brief at the Maine Superior Court. I'm looking forward to seeing what that decision is. But regardless of what that decision is, I feel 100% that I am on the right side of this argument, and regardless of whether we win or lose, I'm going to feel really good about where we took this, and I will be taking this all the way to the Supreme Court. And I did confirm today that if we lose at this stage, then that's the next step, is the United States Supreme Court. If we win at this stage, unfortunately, we're just going to get remanded back down to the Superior Court. But hopefully they have better direction, and we'll go ahead and we'll win at the Superior Court level. But regardless, this is a fight that I have to win, because this is a fight that matters. Anyway, thanks for watching this live stream tonight. Please comment, share, like the video. That helps the YouTube algorithms spread it around YouTube. The more people that like my video, the more YouTube will spread it around, the more people will see it, and thus it creates a cycle And that's how videos go viral, if you've heard of that before. But they only go viral if people like, share, and comment on the videos, and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get over 21,000 subscribers. Maybe tonight's the night where I go over that. I appreciate you watching. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and keep the conversation going. I'd like to give a shout out to the Maine Fusion Center, a secret Maine State Police Department set up in the wake of 9/11 to spy on terrorists, but now spy on anybody who's a little critical of the state of Maine. They have spied on me, they've spied on peaceful protesters, they've spied on people that were against a power line going through Maine, they've spied on Black Lives Matter protesters, and they are my most loyal fan. They've watched all my videos, read all my posts, so a big shout out to the Maine State Police Fusion Center. These videos do take a lot of time. I don't make money on them, so if you would not mind, go check out my website, nationalsi.com, and if you know anybody who does insurance fraud assignments, insurance adjusters, lawyers, please email me their contact information so that I can reach out to them. I'm in the New England area. I'm licensed in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. I work in Rhode Island, and also I'm down in the South too, in Tennessee. So any of those areas are great. If you know people that are in the industry, please forward their information. It would be very, very helpful. Also check out my store. You can buy cool t-shirts and mugs and different things that help support my work. I just want to get to the truth. That's my goal with every case, with every story that I do, and the truth and uncovering the truth is very important, no matter where it leads.
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare place for you. And if I go and prepare place for you, I will come again, and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also.